So, welcome back to Everything Marketplaces, where we talk with founders and leaders from some of today's top marketplaces. So, this is episode 147, which is a real incredible group chat that we just had with Emil Michael, who was previously the chief business officer at Uber. So, Emil was commonly referred to as Travis Kalanick's right hand man and was the chief business officer during an incredible period of hypergrowth at Uber from 2013 to 2017. Emil is also now a strategic advisor and investor to high growth startups. So this is a really great chat with Emil, where we got to learn more about what led him to initially joining Uber, his role as a chief business officer and how that evolved, some of his key learnings and insights, discuss topics like marketplace expansion, building a highly competitive market, Uber's funding and how that helped shape the trajectory of the company. And we also had a great group Q&A. So I really enjoyed this conversation with Emil, and I know you're going to find it a great watch to the end. So, Emil, welcome to the group chat. And this is a real treat to have you join us here today. And wanted to start off by saying, huge thanks for taking the time to do so in advance. So you have some real incredible experience at Uber during their hypergrowth run. So I'm excited to really dive into things here with you. Before we do, though, I think it might be great if you can start off by sharing a little bit more on your background, though, for those that might not know you, and then what led you to joining Uber.
Great to be here too, and I love this subject of your group here because it's like a subcategory of text that's created like hundreds of billions of dollars in value in the world, and like not enough people study it as its own thing, in my view. I got introduced to Travis, who is the founder of Uber, in 2011. It was about 5 employees, and it was like a black car service for rich people. Sounds pretty small, and like an idiot, I didn't join, but we were buddies. We became buddies. I liked him, he liked me socially, so we stayed in touch and went on double dates. We were friends, and the light bulb went off when Uber launched UberX, because that was a democratization of what ride sharing was. And it also opened up an enormous amount of supply of cars. So when you talk about marketplace, you have 2 or 3 sides of a marketplace. Cars and drivers was one side. And we went from black car drivers, which was a small set, usually in big cities that are high income, and you went to every car, Toyota Corolla and so on. That side of the marketplace got huge, and that kind of got it. So I joined him in 2013 with a very vague title. I was SVP of business, and I had no direct reports. And it was one of those deals where like, come in and I was at 40 at the time. So it's not like it was my first rodeo, but I was so compelled by the idea and by Travis in particular. I said, look, I'll come in and we'll figure it out as we go. And that was a start in 2013. We're about 150 employees. By the time he and I left in 2017, so 4 years later, we're 20,000 employees. We're in 150 countries. Our valuation went from 300 million to 70 billion. We were in Uber Eats. So it's like an incredible ride in a really, really short time.
So, that's really incredible just to, hear about the early days of Uber and at the beginning. Of course, we all know the sense of scale that it's at today. So you briefly mentioned your role when you first joined, but could you maybe walk us through how that changed and evolved as Uber began to really scale?
Sure. So when I first joined, it was about 150 people, and that meant that we were in probably 5 or 6 of the top cities in the US. And the reason was that at that time, you think about 2013, we physically needed employees in the cities because we needed to recruit drivers. And the way you would recruit drivers, like knock on windows of black car drivers, you would stand outside the taxi medallion licensing division to try to, get people to sign up for your, to be a driver. You'd throw parties and invite the who's who in town, give them free Uber rides. It was like guerrilla ground up marketing. So those 150 people are really spread around the country, recruiting drivers and riders for each side of the marketplace in each city, right? And Uber is different because each marketplace is city-based. Unlike Airbnb, which has this global marketplace, our marketplaces were city by city. The amount of time you were willing to wait for a ride, the amount you were willing to pay, depended on the city economics and the city supply of drivers and so on. So that's sort of the state it was. We hadn't gone global yet. We hadn't raised a lot of money. Uber Eats was not even in the picture. Um, and so I joined with this title, and the idea was that I would be the face to the business community. And Travis would sort of, he wanted to be head of product and engineering. Neither of us wanted to do the public policy politics stuff because that was the, shaking hands and kissing babies and dealing with regulators. Um, Probably because none of us were like, wow, that sounds like not fun. And I don't know if we'd be good at it because we're too aggro, but he was product engineering. I was everything business. And that evolved to me running fundraising, M&A, global expansion. I was GM of our China business. I built our Uber for enterprise business, where we sort of sold to large corporations to transport their employees around over a very quick amount of time. And I spent a lot of time in China. He spent a lot of time in China and India because those were two huge markets for us. And that's sort of how it evolved. In that time period, we raised $15 billion of equity. So we did round after round after round after round. We were in so many countries. We were trying to invent new services. We were close to doing something called Uber Payments because we were doing, essentially our own payments, everyday payments on so many different services. We're like, why don't we have Uber Money? That's the thing I regret not finishing before we left. That and the Instacart competitor.
Yeah, no, you mentioned a lot of topics that we're definitely going to jump into, here. So I guess if we can go back to the earlier stages, so you mentioned at one point, as far as, of course, Uber being like a local marketplace, right? So dependent upon the supply and demand, the kind of liquidity in the local markets. So, what were some of those kind of like early challenges when you thought about marketplace expansion? And could you kind of like walk us through, like just, maybe with a few examples of how nuanced the markets were?
Yeah. So we had a globe in the office with green, yellow, and red pins that we put in there. And the green ones were, we think regulatorily, we're okay here. Yellow, we're not sure. Red, we know we're banned. And we said, okay, let's pick up the green and yellows first, and let's see what happens to the reds. And so we really were very intentional about every local market. We had a pricing committee. So we would say, okay, we're going into Kansas City, let's say, because it's green. There's like usually a hole in the regulations which make this mostly legal. And we say, okay, what is the GDP per capita in Kansas? What can people pay? What are the local cab fares? What is gas cost for a driver? Insurance? What is the average life of a car? What's the unemployment rate? How many people are working in low wage jobs where this might be a better opportunity versus not? And then we tried to develop our own thesis about how to get to liquidity fastest there. And liquidity for a marketplace meant that there were enough drivers on one side and enough riders on the other side so that both parties were motivated to be in the marketplace. So you woke up to go to the airport, you had confidence that you can get an Uber ride within 5 minutes. On the driver's side is, could they go out and make enough money so that they'd want to do it again? Right? Could they go out and make $50 to buy their girlfriend dinner? Could they, spend a weekend working and so they could buy their textbooks for this next semester? What are the things that they're trying to achieve, and in how long could they achieve them? And we really studied that. And, we weren't always right the first time around, but we deployed a pricing model and we recruited so that there was never too much of an imbalance between riders and drivers. Although the biggest problem always, and still today with Uber, is there's just never enough drivers. There just isn't. The supply side always lagged the demand side, but we took very good care. And as we figured out this model in Kansas City, we wrote a playbook, and we gave that to the playbook for the person who was going to launch St. Louis, and then for the one who was going to launch Paris, and then for one who was going to launch Mumbai. And it evolved over time with nuance so that any new launcher of a city could start with 80% of the problem solved, basically. And that's how we scaled really fast.
Yeah, and I guess for a little bit of context, could you just share a little bit more as far as like when you mentioned scaling very fast, what that meant for Uber at the time too?
So I joined in 2013. We were doing $100 million in gross bookings. That means total fares paid by a rider to the system in January. By September of 13, so 8 months later, we were at $1 billion in gross bookings in 13. By September of 16, we were 10 billion. So we 10x in 3 years. And then today, I think Uber's 150 billion. So you could see the stark kind of growth in what that meant. And then from an employee standpoint, to the extent that's another measure, we went from 150 to 20,000 in 4 years. And it was largely because of this we need to feet on the ground thing. Now, you don't have to do that anymore, right? You could recruit drivers online because they're mostly online. But back in 2013, we gave them smartphones because they didn't have smartphones on average. And so we had long lines on each office where we'd hand out smartphones, program them. They'd come in for repairs. We had like iPhone repair guy sitting at the office repairing phones for drivers, that kind of thing. It was a very gritty manual, and we just took the pain. We were like, this is how you build a gritty, real-world marketplace business.
Yeah, no, certainly. That's really interesting to learn more about. So I guess a somewhat related kind of topic that I wanted to bring up as far as the competition, right? And as far as marketplaces where some markets might have like a winner takes all, how did being first or second in the market impact Uber?
Now I have some time to reflect on what that era of free money was like, right? From 2013 to 2021, we all lived in a zero interest rate environment. And so we would raise money. We would spend it to subsidize riders and drivers to build a marketplace until it was liquid. And then Lyft would come in, or some other competitor abroad would come in. They'd do the same thing and they'd steal 30% market share the next day. And then we're like, oh, we now have to spend more money to keep our market share. So long as money was free, the market share in the market moved. But our thesis was this: once the musical chair stopped, meaning the money was not easy to get, the company with the largest market share was going to be the winner, and that winner was going to take mostly all. And you see that happening today. It's finally happened after a decade where Lyft has sort of been relegated to a 15, 20% market share player. It's very hard to make profit at 15, 20% market share. Very easy to make profit at 80, 85% market share. And that's why I see Uber is now worth $120 billion market cap. They're worth $5 billion. So the stark difference in the profitability in these marketplaces, if you can become the dominant player, it was just hard to prove dominance back in the day because everyone got money pretty freely. But those times have changed.
Yeah, definitely worth noting here for founders that they times have changed on that. So yes, so you also have the unique kind of experience of being so early at Uber, and with the kind of expansion and scale, also seeing network effects, right? That marketplaces of course have. So could you maybe share more about when you saw network effects kind of like start to form in the early days, and maybe how that I would say just more generally speaking started to play out?
Yeah, so I've always envied Airbnb's network effects because they are they're global, right? If you're planning a vacation in Paris, you go to Airbnb and they have their inventory, and vice versa. If you're a Parisian planning a vacation in Los Angeles, you go to Airbnb because of their selection. Uber wasn't like that, right? You lived in a city, 80% of the rides in any city, at least, were taken by people who lived in that city. So they didn't care about liquidity in London. They cared about liquidity in Miami. And so therefore our network effects were local. And the way we thought about network effects was how many minutes to take a ride, what are the price per ride, so that no one had to price compare against anyone else. They always thought we were the best option. And how do I get drivers to believe I'm going to give them the most rides? And I had to create a loyalty point program so that they stayed with me and they preferred an Uber ride over a Lyft ride. And that played out over time, and it's playing out now today. It's you push a button, get a ride. Uber's faster. Cheaper or not, but on average, it's much cheaper than Lyft. So it's faster and it's cheaper. and the drivers make more money. That network effect is what's really profitable, but it's very local. The only non-local network effect for ride sharing right now is the brand recognition. It's now you go to another country, you're like, oh, I assume Uber's there. I should use it. I don't even know who the local competitor is because it's a global brand, but it's a fairly weak network of global, non-local network effect.
Yeah, no, definitely worth mentioning as far as, brand as somewhat of a network effect there. And of course, Uber is probably one of the most notable brands when it comes to marketplaces. So are there any, I would say like specific learnings around brand building and maybe even kind of like managing, I would say like the public kind of perception of your brand with Uber from your experience?
Well, I'll tell you this. We weren't very good at PR, obviously. And it was partly an artifact of the business we were in. We were running up against one of the most corrupt areas of any economy, not just the U.S. economy. Transportation, taxi medallions, that segment of any city's industry is, for whatever reason, highly corrupt and highly rent-seeking. In Japan, in Joburg, and in Jamaica, Queens. It just is. And the regulations were set up to repel competitors. So over time, the taxi medallion lobby had worked with the local politicians to create an incredibly protective set of regulations to keep competitors out, to keep prices high, to pay drivers really low, and so on. So we were breaking that. And when you're breaking that kind of system, you don't do it with nice conversations and persuasion. You have to sort of you have to really go at it really hard, and that makes you sort of the bad guy, right? And I think that's not necessarily the case in other marketplace businesses. Like OpenTable is a marketplace business. You don't have to be a bad guy to be OpenTable, because restaurant, you want to go there to find all the restaurants in the city. Restaurants are happy to take the reservations. Maybe they don't like the price they paid, but it's a nice business. It's not sort of disrupting sort of a corrupt sort of element of the economic architecture. We were. So if I could do it all over again, I probably would have realized that there was a point where we won. And by winning, I meant consumers all over the world were like, I want Uber or Uber-like services. I deserve that. I don't deserve calling a taxi, having it never show up. I don't deserve getting in the taxi and not having a credit card machine. I don't deserve being Black and not being able to go to Harlem because a cab driver won't take me. I don't deserve that. And we knew then that we were on the winning side of history and the politicians would all fall. We probably should have turned into a more nice corporate brand at that point. But I will say, like, the one guy and company I admire who's sort of worked at both sides is Airbnb. I keep talking about them because think about Airbnb. Like, there's a way worse stuff that happens inside Airbnbs than in Ubers, right? People rent them for parties, like all kinds of camera, very weird stuff. And in Airbnbs, your neighbors hate you and they live in that city, right? So they have a lot of opposition, but they're like the nicest company in the world. You would never know from their branding that they fight incredibly hard regulatory battles, have really gnarly situations. So maybe there's a way to do it that we just couldn't, but it was hard in this business.
Yeah, no, I could only imagine. So I know as marketplaces here, as far as, improving the status quo and, driving change and being somewhat disruptive, there's a lot that kind of comes with it. But it's also worth noting that, of course, Uber kind of paved the way in that. And, I even think now it's almost like we not only saw the kind of Uber for X, but, push the button and expect something on demand, and a whole slew of kind of marketplaces that started after that. So,
yeah, sure did.
So one of the other kind of topics that I actually want to talk about too, and you briefly mentioned it earlier, but as far as, Uber, moving from just being, kind of ride sharing to launching Uber Eats and, taking a kind of bet on that. So could you maybe share a little bit more around, what led to kind of Uber Eats and, maybe some, like, looking back, some learnings from that?
Yes, Uber. So one of the original visions that Travis and I had was we were going to be what we called an urban logistics fabric. And that fabric, meaning we had points, if you think about a caching network, we were going to have points of entry all over the city. And that point of entry maybe was a car or a vehicle of some sort, and it was going to transport people, things, food, groceries, and so on. And that was going to be the fungible element that moved things around. So the next biggest market after transporting people was transporting food, we thought. Because if you remember, there was Grubhub and I forget the other one, really tiny, right? As a business. Why? Because Grubhub relied on the restaurant to provide their own driver. So you're a great small pizza shop, and you have order volume that goes up and down. You're kind of a little bit on tight string. You're like, I'm not going to hire a delivery guy to sit there because in busy times he can't deliver enough, and in slow times I'm paying him. They're not doing that. So our innovation was, we're going to bring the delivery. You just have to provide the food. Because we have these nodes all over the city, we're going to use our network to take the food that you have from your restaurant delivered to somebody. So that was an innovation which was not obvious at the time. And it turns out that allowed us to build a huge menu. And it also turns out that what do people want when they open a food delivery app? They want variety. They was like, do I want Chinese? Do I want Indian? Do I want Italian? That is the number one thing they want, is variety. And that allowed us to provide variety for them. And it was an incredible innovation because within 2 years, we got bigger than Grubhub that had been around for 15 years. And then that should have been extended to grocery. Travis and I got booted out of the company by then, and Instacart sort of had the mantle, but that was the natural extension of bringing delivery to commerce as opposed to waiting for the commerce companies to develop their own delivery networks.
Yeah, no, and also too, I wanted to mention, as far as like when it comes to marketplaces, a lot of times here is, earlier to kind of, mid-stage teams, we're thinking about like the importance of, sequencing, right? And like if and kind of when to expand or kind of, layer on a new kind of service or category. So, how do you think about that now, even kind of working with and investing in marketplaces?
Look, in a world of infinite money, it was easy to parallelize these things, right? Again, back to make sure that people don't learn the lesson today that was in it from a different environment back then. That being said, I do think there are dangers in going too long with one business line past the point where you have product market fit and not starting to think about what the next iteration of the new business should be. Now, is it possible that the one thing you have product market fit at is so explosive that it just makes sense to do that and nothing else? Of course, there are situations like that. But oftentimes, I think you see this with a lot of fintech players today, not marketplaces necessarily, but they like, oh, we're going to have a credit card for corporations, one product, or I'm going to have a banking account with a really cheap debit card thing. And they did well on that. But then all of a sudden, they sort of saturated that market. And then you're like, okay, well, what's the next thing? And it turns out for some of these companies, like, well, now it's doing expense management software. And now that takes a year and a half to build, and there's incumbent players. And so you don't want to do this serially too much. If you have one product that has product market fit. If you don't have that, then yes, it's much more dangerous to be spreading your bets too wide, too early in this economic environment.
That's definitely that's going to be super helpful for founders here. So of course you also have some really great experience when it not only comes to team building, but executive hiring. So do you have any maybe any kind of tips that you could share with us here as founders when it comes to team building and executive hiring?
Yeah, I mean, I took recruiting as a very serious part of my job, and it was so painful. So I had to get in my mind. I did 3 interviews a day, 30 minutes each, 5 days a week for my entire 4 years at Uber. So that meant that I did about 750 interviews a year for 4 years, 3,000 interviews over 4 years. And sometimes I didn't even have a job opening. I just want to meet people, categorize them, figure out when I needed them. I knew who the best people in the world are and why. I refined my interview questions. I created a machine on it. And the reason is because, it's so trite to say that the people are everything, but it's something that no human likes to do as a job, is to interview. But if you can force yourself to make it part of your job, and I figured out how to constrain it, then it's sort of a top of funnel thing. Like the more data points you put in the top of funnel, the better quality you're going to get out the bottom, right? So, and I made sure that people felt respected during the interview. I always followed up. I always said no quickly if it was a no quickly. I never wanted to be one of those companies that just flaked, because I wanted to be the company that people knew they could come to get an answer quickly, and that made my funnel better, right? People were like, oh, these guys are fast. They have an opinion. Maybe it works. Maybe it doesn't. So I really took it as a core competency of my job. That's generally. When it came to execs, it's harder in that execs you need to spend more time with because there's higher risk and higher reward. And execs, by definition, have gotten through life being charming and knowing how to do interviews. so they're much more adept at the whole process. So your job as a hiring manager in that situation is to try to get underneath the gloss and find out who this person really is. What do they and their family want? Are they going to fit? They say they're going to fit. They say they want to work this hard. They say they want this kind of experience, but do they really? And no matter how good a job you do, the failure rate with hiring execs is still 50-50, because it's just a very high failure rate. And my only advice there is do your best up front. And if it's not working, mutually agree it's not working, quickly. And usually you could tell within 6 months whether it's working or not. And some of this comes from, they've been at a big company or they've been at a small company that got big. Their desire to do the work that a startup needs wanes, and they may not even know it, right? They've forgotten they don't want to build desks anymore. They want to have papers presented to them and proposals and sit in rooms and make decisions. And that's not how it is at a startup, right? Everyone's in the fight. So the fighting spirit, the ability to not have ego, especially when it comes to young people who've built a company. And that's really one of the big failure points. They come in sometimes and say, oh, I'm glad I'm here. I could teach the kids how to do X, Y, or Z. You're like, hey, these kids built this place before you got here, buddy. I would take a step back and make sure you're adding value before you think you're going to teach other people how to do stuff. So it's that sort of emotional maturity, high EQ, low ego that ends up being points of success factors when you are looking to bring in those first one or two senior hires as the company gets its stride.
Those are definitely a great, might lead to a few questions when we get to the group Q&A here. So speaking of, before we do, we have, of course, couldn't have a chat with you without, mentioning, fundraising and, not only what your role was like with that, but also journey. So could you maybe just kind of like walk us through from like a high level, what that journey was like?
Yeah, so I've done three other companies before Uber, and I'd raised money for all of them, but never at the scale that we did at Uber. And I'm a former lawyer, never practiced law, but went to law school. I took a lot of finance classes when I was at law school because I was like, I don't want to be a lawyer, so I better learn something else while I'm here. I did a lot of business development deals, like partnership deals. So I sort of purposely tried to have as broad a skill set as required. It turns out that raising money really, if you have, and you can learn all these things. Like I learned how to accounting on my own so that I understood how VC firms were looking at our accounting. I tried to understand everyone's perspective so that I was pretty functional in knowing how to sell something and what would resonate and what wasn't. And Travis also had a pretty methodical view about how to run a process. And so we together sort of brought together what I thought was sort of an auction-like process with some EQ around the edge to make sure that it was an optimal process. We called it the home show. So we literally stress on a presentation for 4 weeks. Like, we were really, like, people were like, oh, you guys, just like waving money in the door. It's like, oh, we put together like 50-page PowerPoint decks, deep data rooms. We're super upfront about our competition, where our weaknesses were. We're like, they're going to find out anyway, so let's not BS anyone. Let's just tell everyone all the stuff. And then we'd schedule 3 investor meetings a day, 3 hours each for 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. And we just run through them. And then we'd have a week of due diligence. Then we'd ask for term sheets. And then we'd select the term sheet and the composition around and move forward. And sort of in 8 weeks, we'd have $1 billion in the bank. And we told everyone up front what it was going to look like. And it looked like that at the end. So no one felt that they were burned or not. No, again, this was a 0 interest rate environment. This was also the hottest company in the world. So we were able to do all that. So you don't always have the leverage we had to do that. So that's why Uber is not the perfect example, but I want to at least give you those stories to let you know how we did it there and to great success.
Yeah, no, that's really cool to learn more about. Cool. So we're gonna go ahead and get into some questions, because I promised our founders we would do so here. That sounds good to you.
Sure.
Let's see. Hey, Noah, do you want to jump on first here?
My question is regarding to going into market. So what were the kind of the key factors that influenced Uber's decision making when going into a new market?
I'll go deeper on what I said before. Is we did a lot of research, and for us, it went down to the local level, because there are local transportation levels, sometimes county, sometimes state, sometimes national, depending on the country. And we'd sort of do a deep dive into what we thought that meant for our deployment in that country. Was it going to be easy, hard? How big the opportunity was? How small? The economics of that country mattered too. Like, who was spending money in that country? Was it something where there was disposable income, where they could trade off from a train ride or a subway ride to an Uber ride? So it was a pretty detailed analysis there about what we did. And as a counterexample, Japan has great taxis. They run on time. They're clean. Japanese people and Japanese businesses are rule followers. So going in there, breaking the rules, or taking license with the rules, with a population that doesn't like it, with a system that kind of works, put that last on the list. It was the third tier, part of the list. Azerbaijan, some of these other countries where GDP per capita was low, they had gypsy cabs already. They had sort of like unofficial Uber already, was also low on the list. Egypt was higher on the list because they kind of had this gypsy cab phenomenon, but it was such a big city and people hated negotiating for every ride. So we put a non-negotiation thing on every ride, and that made it a good market. So it was a pretty detailed analysis, and it was way more inexpensive to do that research up front and critical thinking and tiering of your opportunities for deployment among countries than it was to go and fail just because you didn't do the work. That was our philosophy.
Awesome. That's a great question. Hey, Danny, do you want to jump on?
Hey, Emil, Danny here. Just wanted to deep dive a little bit into Uber Eats, and you've already kind of touched on. So would like to understand like what insights do you have around kind of what needed to change in Uber's approach, whether that's launching a city or anything else, and maybe things that didn't necessarily work well, kind of from your approach at Uber to Uber Eats.
Uber Eats was somewhat easier from a marketplace standpoint because of the following. You could go to a restaurant and say, sign up. And they didn't necessarily care that you had 1 or 10 orders that month, because signing up cost them nothing, right? It's like, here's a free iPad, put it on your wall. If an order comes through, fulfill it. If it doesn't, no problem. You got an iPad that just sits there. So we could build up the supply side And then before we marketed to the demand side. So we're always having to balance. And because humans want to see variety, we're like, let's focus on getting variety. Then we can spend our money on marketing, and people open the app and go, holy cow, there's a lot of options here. So that was sort of one key difference. One key thing we were wrong about was that we thought drivers who transported people would also want to transport food. And that would be the synergy. We're like, remember I talked about this sort of network of nodes around the city? That thesis was wrong. Turns out people who want to deliver food are much less social. They don't want to talk to the people in the back seats. They kind of want to drive, pick up, drop off. They also, we were more tolerant of them having crappy cars because no one's sitting there. So for them, the cost was lower because they had a crappy car. They didn't have to have a fancier car. So you were accessing a different type of driver who sort of like had a lower cost basis and didn't like, it's not didn't like people. I don't want to make them seem like monsters. They just preferred to work on their own, right? And so the overlap in driver base was like 10%. It was amazing to me. It was shocking to me that people who didn't want to do one did the other. And people think it was smell in the car. Like, yeah, it was some of that, but it was really just different type of people. The number of women who applied to be Uber Eats drivers was like 3 times the percentage of women that applied to be Uber Rides drivers. So maybe it was a safety thing there. I don't have to have a male in my back seat. I could just deliver. Even though you're delivering to people's houses, you're like, I don't get it, but maybe they could drop off and just leave. So those were some of the key differences between those. DoorDash is a much more formidable competitor in Uber Eats than Lyft was to Uber Rides. DoorDash is very innovative, and they did some things that, when Travis and I left, Uber Eats was way bigger than DoorDash in the US. Now the flip has happened. They went into the suburbs faster. They had a much more ingenious way of creating variety on their market. So they would sign up a restaurant without the restaurant even knowing. They go on their website, download the menu, put it on DoorDash. Someone would order it. They'd have a DoorDash person call the restaurant, order the stuff, pay retail for it. And so they had variety like day one. They opened a city in like one day. And then at the end of the month, some sales guy would go to a restaurant and say, hey, we delivered you, $1,000 this month. Don't you want to sign up? And they're like, yeah, I guess so. So we called it over the top. So they did like very ingenious things like that Dora and the team after we didn't do. So, those are some lessons from the differences between those businesses.
We'll see. Dimitri, do you want to come on? Saw you raise your hand.
I have a question for you about economics and economists and marketplaces. So Uber is very unusual in having economists show up really early to work on both kind of policy stuff that you were talking about, with the regulation and so on, but also on product, pricing, and experimentation. And if you're sort of advising a marketplace now, what's kind of the earliest stage where you think economists can add value, and where would be kind of that area within the company?
Economists, for us, like you said, they had a few different functions. Probably the most important function they had was trying to prove to the cities that we were a net good for the city, meaning we reduced congestion, we reduced car ownership, we reduced the need for parking in downtown urban areas. And to combat some of the counter notions, which is, no, you did cause traffic. In fact, you caused more accidents because Uber drivers don't pay attention, or you had more, assaults happen in the city. So he was mostly used in the policy realm. In the pricing and surge and all that, we less used economists and more used algorithms and finance folks. It was much more of a trading floor on pricing, and on policy is much more of an economist sort of thing that was used from a policy standpoint, if that made sense. So, look, if you're a marketplace business, you don't have regulatory, everyone loves you, and you don't have to have an economist to churn out policy papers, that's great. but if you're in a position where you have to, you do. But it's is not something I would seek to do unless you must.
Cool. We're gonna try to squeeze in one more here if we can. So, hey, Michael, do you want to come on, like quick?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. First of all, you're such a wealth of information, so thanks for taking the time to do this.
Sure.
Quick question. In the early days, the drivers, the supply side, can you think of an example where you wanted to change their behavior, influence the way they were, like, say, used to doing something, quote, the old way? You're trying to get them to do it the new way, and you had to either like enforce it or maybe incentivize it. Does anything jump to mind?
Well, the star system that we had, 5 stars, was a very effective. People forget how much that was part of Uber's brand promise in the beginning, and how we used that to either coach drivers to be better, to take them off the system, to reward them for having so many 5-star trips in a row. And consumers took them seriously. Now, mostly you walk out of an Uber, you have 5 stars, you don't even think about it. In the beginning, people took this stuff really seriously, and it was a really valuable indicator of what we could do. So let's say the driver, in an Uber Black didn't open the door for a customer, right? Back in the day, the customer would say that was 3 stars. And we try to get as much as we could, the customer say why. He's like, well, he didn't close the door for me. So then we would say to the driver anonymously, you'd do better if you close the door for people in your star rating, right? And they cared about their star ratings because that entitled them to certain bonuses and, certain classes of achievements, so to speak. So we definitely use that system along with money and rewards, psychic rewards, financial rewards, to try to change behavior among drivers. And look, people complain. The car didn't smell good. It was smelled like those trees that are too strong, too much cologne. I mean, you name it. Riders will tell you what's happening with driver. And frankly, drivers learned over time to say customers were rude, or they slammed the door, was a big complaint. They puked in my car, so you end up collecting a lot of data because of the frequency of transactions. And you often can act on that to hopefully make both sides better.
Awesome. It's a great last question. Thanks, Michael. So, well, thanks, Emil. This is such a great chat, and we really appreciate taking the time to join us here today. So, you, of course, paved the way for us all here in the world of marketplaces with Uber. So it was really cool to learn more about it. Kind of going back to the beginning and diving into some of these topics here. And once again, I really appreciate taking the time to join us. And I guess last but not least here. So I like to kind of wrap up the chats with the question. And that's, if you could go right back to before you joined Uber, what would you tell yourself about maybe marketplaces more specifically?
I guess I didn't think about the word and concept of marketplaces too much before Uber. The one I did think about was OpenTable, because it had sort of achieved this dominant position where a restaurant had to have it. And because consumers were they were getting so many consumers through it. And I tried to think about that. And now in retrospect, and so when I get to Uber, I thought about it a little bit less of a marketplace, although I did feel like this supply and demand dynamics are awesome. And this notion of it's snowing out and it's going to cost you more, but the driver gets paid more, and that's going to create a better situation. I thought about it in raw kind of supply demand sort of concepts, and how maybe it was too capitalist, how you can make money in these different ways all the time, whereas in New York at 4:00, whether it's raining or sunny, you can't get a taxi. It was totally inefficient, but Uber is creating efficiency so people get what they want. And it is interesting that you see something like OpenTable that has now never invented beyond its core. It could have been Toast. It could have been done so many supply chain things for restaurant on the backside. It could have been the beginning to a delivery platform that allowed restaurants to manage their inflow, outflow, and it just sat there and kind of did nothing. So there is sort of back to one of the questions you ask is like, when is it important to start your next sort of evolution of products? And that's a good example of a company that never did, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great example to wrap things up here. And time for kind of a quick plug. Where can we keep up with you at?
I'm at Emil Michael at Twitter. That's the best place. I'm in LinkedIn, but I, like most people, it's a lot of chaff in the wheat there. So Twitter's where I kind of post and DM and hear people out. Sometimes I'm on CNBC talking about the sharing economy every now and again, every month or so. But yeah, those are the best places to hear me. And it was great to meet you all. And I'm glad you're excited about this sort of segment here, and look forward to seeing you out in the world doing some cool stuff.